One is this hydrological point. Given the variation in rainfall over space and over time, some kind of storage becomes necessary to tide over, from one season to another, from one wet area to a dry area, and so on. The only question is about, should it be large centralized storages behind dams, or should we have dispersed, decentralized local storages, or even direct charge into the groundwater aquifer? And this is what has been debated. Initially, before this whole movement of local water harvesting and watershed development started in the 1980s, before that you had only these big projects. At that stage, if anybody raised the question of storage having an adverse impact on hydrological cycle, you would have been damned as an anti-dam person, anti-development, anti-dam. But the same engineers started talking about the downstream impacts of water harvesting, small-scale water harvesting. It's very interesting that these people who never worried about downstream impacts of the dams, they are now talking about downstream impacts of small-scale local water harvesting. But leaving that aside, any interference with the natural flow or runoff or precipitation is bound to have some effect. So if you want to create storages, if I may, let me put it very dramatically, there is a dilemma. Shall we catch the water as it falls in various places and stop the river from forming? Or shall we wait for the river to form and kill it with a dam? What do you do? Now, this is a false dilemma because these are two extreme statements. A kind of modest harvesting of rainwater is not likely to have a major impact on runoff. Even one has to be careful. First, where it should be done and how much should be done. This is not something which is a free-for-all. You can't let everybody go and catch water wherever it falls. In fact, in some countries, this is by law prohibited, interference with the rainfall runoff. But you need to do it. You can do it in a decentralized way, but you need some technical advice even there. Of course, Rajendra Singh would not agree. He thinks that his people in the villagers knew more engineering than maybe. But you do need some kind of a technical knowledge so that you do this at the right place and you do it in the right amount. If you do that, you can both do some local augmentation of available water for local use. At the same time, you do not have a serious impact on the runoff into the river. So this is really the answer is you don't sort of postulate an extreme dilemma, but you learn to do it in a modest scale. And so that is the hydrological. In fact, the late Dr. Narasimhan raised this point once. There was a big exchange in the Hindu, with 2 or 3 articles on this subject about the hydrological effect of this kind of extensive local activity. This is something which one should look at, definitely. Sometimes the impact may be, you catch water in your village, upstream village, there may be less water in the downstream village. On the other hand, because of your activity and you're catching the water behind a check dam and sending it down to the aquifer, the high level may come up in the next village, 2 miles down the road. That's what happened in Rajasthan. Because of not only of building these dams, but the cost that it imposes on the environment, the cost that it imposes on people who are going to be displaced, livelihoods, on wildlife, and have you done a proper balance of what you expect to get out of it and what costs, direct, financial, indirect, ecological, that you are incurring. So it is necessary. Without it, you cannot fight an unsound project. What happened in Nepal, there was a famous project called Arun 3, which was opposed by a number of people, and eventually the World Bank dropped the project. The argument there was not ecological. It was entirely economic. The people who were agitating against the project proved to the World Bank that it was a totally unviable, economically unviable project. So that argument is of some value. At the same time, it is also dangerous, as you rightly said, because if you adopt a cost-benefit calculus, you will easily come across a kind of argument. All right, 3,000 people are getting displaced here, 30,000 people are being benefited here. Absolutely. So this is better than that. So let the 3,000 people go to hell, it doesn't matter. These 30,000 people will, see, this kind of cost-benefit analysis is very dangerous. So one must be very careful about how one does it. There are some things which cannot be quantified, which have an absolute existential value. And there are some things, you know, there is a particular writer called Mark Sadoff, who was very strongly against valuation, because he felt that you're falling into their own trap. You're adopting their language. And the value of the system, or the value of the river, the value of nature is not that you can put some money value on it. It has a value in itself. Not only instrumental value, that you can get some value out of it, use it, but in its very existence it has a value. So it is, one has to look at it very carefully. But at the same time, at particular stages, it becomes useful to tell the engineers and economists who are arguing for a particular project that in your own terms it is bad. That's a very useful kind of argument. So these are the 2 points that I wanted to make. Now, any other? Yes.
I think on the cost benefit and versus faith issue, India has decided that tiger is not part of cost benefit analysis. We will save tiger. Protected areas will be saved. Protected tiger areas will be saved. Even if you are proposing a project which will have benefit cost ratio of 10, because we want to save the tiger. So it's a question of fundamental no-go areas. Similarly, I think whenever you postulate a policy, a cost benefit analysis or anything, you also have certain no-go zones. Yeah. So that will have to be a combination of things, not just one. And it will have to be a much more democratic than just a technocratic decision. A governance in which people have placed, what Gaparinita was saying, right from the planning to decision making stage. So I think that's one area. So it's not black and white. We need to use a multiple criteria to arrive at the right way decisions and right way of arriving at decisions. So that's on one aspect. On the issue of, I think, impact of rainwater harvesting, I entirely agree that watershed development, rainwater harvesting can have, if it is done very extensively, downstream impact. It should be studied. But there are postulations from the Ministry of Water Resources. Even in the climate action plan, they said that rainwater harvesting and watershed development should be allowed when it is socially desirable. And one of the ways they see socially desirable is that if there is a downstream dam, then the water to the downstream dam should not be affected. But that's not acceptable proposition at all. That to save the dam, your dam, downstream dam, and irrigation from that, you stop rainwater harvesting and watershed development. That will not be. So, that we need to be very wary of that kind of proposition.
Yes.
I have one or two observations to make about the discussion that is going on. I think about the discussion that is going on. One of them is that rainwater harvesting and the issue of the river suffering from it is a fallacy, in my opinion. The fallacy can be dramatized by saying that if you are drinking a glass of water, have you consumed it completely, or are you going to release it? So you are drinking water only for a short period, and then you are going to put it back into the natural system. So by having a decentralized system like in Rajasthan, where a lot of people do water harvesting, or small ponds nearby every village, it should not actually be disturbing the, in the long run, over the period of a whole year at least, it should not be disturbing the river. I don't know what is the actual experience of the engineers, but engineers have often gone wrong on their assessments, and that is the history of India's development. The other point I'm thinking about is that if the currency you are dealing with is economic, especially when your Prime Minister and your Planning Commissioner have absolutely blinded approach of economics only and nothing else, then you have to build in the element of environmental costs, because this is the only language they understand. This is the only language that economists and engineers understand. So what other language can you use? Till the other language is currently available, Till then, this will have to be used. And I'm fully aware of the dangers that you have mentioned, and which is obvious. But then, if you put environmental costs on fisheries getting destroyed today as, say, 1 million rupees, it doesn't mean that you cannot revise it tomorrow. There are, for example, there are tremendous difficulties in collecting income tax. But does it mean that the income tax law should be abolished? There is a lot of chori of income tax, but does it mean that you should have no system? The system becomes bad only if you are spending more money on collecting the revenue rather than the actual value of the collection. So till then, I mean, the whole society goes into a process. So let the engineers and the economists understand that we can defeat them by their own arguments by talking in their language. If you are playing cricket, you cannot talk about hockey goals. You have to talk about in terms of runs only.
So long as we don't get deluded by that language.
Yes. And if the circumstances of the nation are that you have to speak a particular language, then you better speak their language. And that argument that you're saying, I mean, that's an argument which is worth following over a period of a century or two. But when it comes to winning immediate goals, then you may have to shift your strategy. Thank you.
I have two quick questions to both the researchers. One, in their tourneys, in their visits to the riverine systems, have the researchers gone through any archaeological spots or monuments, memorials like dolmens, menhirs, etc., or inscriptions?
Yeah. Yeah, as I shared with you in Shastri, there have been also in Vashishti. Vashishti actually has a sort of a channelized system, underground channels, which have not been studied and which are now in a state of disrepair, complete disrepair.
Paleologically?
No, this was maybe made in the 14th century or something, but it brings water from the river to the temple, and it's also supplies it to some of the houses there. It's an underground system, but it's
any inscriptions?
Well, I did not find any, but then it can't be conclusive.
Because forests should be nearby in some other spots, probably.
This will figure in the, if a good EA is done, should be part of it.
This should be part. And the final question from my side to Mr. Hegde, in Chamarajanagar, illegal mining of the horizontal slab-like marbles is prevalent.
Replying to your last question, I would say that fortunately, unfortunately, when the Veerapan was there, that was stopped. But now it's again reopened because of the political pressures.
Veerapan was serving a purpose.
I think
in his own way. In his own way.
Yes, so the problem, because of the political this thing, it still exists. But coming back to your the first question, which is about archaeological sites, along Sharavati, we find the kind of inscriptions from the Jainism days, and still those kind of sites exist. Inscriptions are there. Archaeological departments are doing the studies. So the whole area was known as kind of pepper queen. The forests provided pepper, wild pepper. So we always call from pepper queen to timber queen. We have made it the timber queen. Anyway, coming back to the middle path advocated by Ayerji.
Sir, rock arts, any rock arts? Rock arts, rock paintings?
No.
But in Gokarna, one of my gurus, Dr. Sundara Adiga, Sundara, who is most well known in Karnataka circles, he told me in Gokarna there is great scope for marine archaeology. His students have found out some of the sites which had mantaps running to 100 meters under the sea. Rather, within 1 to 2 kilometers into the sea, they have found out a mantapa and a corridor running to about 100 meters that is dated 1500 BC. He told me last month, sent me some images too.
I think it's a very interesting observation and
in
it
Gokarna.
needs to be studied. Yeah. Coming back to your middle path, I feel that we need construction of the water bodies, but my basic question in that is,
for example, Parinita said already 34,000 dams have been built in Maharashtra for Western Ghats. And my basic question here, the dilemma again, you have built these dams. Why don't you take care of the sustainability of that dam itself? Because providing the energy security for the industries or whatever, the IT sector. So whatever the structures you have built, to take care of the sustainability of those structures is more important at this juncture. I know all the engineers won't agree, but at least address this question first. And second, think of, we might have to have the water bodies, but only after addressing this first question is more important, I felt.